My name is Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change, based primarily at the University of Manchester, but also at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And I'm involved in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. I've been working on climate change issues for three and a half decades, I think now. I should also just say that in the previous existence, I was a design engineer in the oil and gas industry and actually did work offshore in the North Sea. I was involved in the Bray A and Bray B projects, one of the design engineers for Bray B, and in the hookup and commissioning for several years offshore. So I have an engineering background, which is quite helpful as well. I do have a presentation. I'll go through this as quickly as I originally can here, then try and keep it just to 15 minutes. So I'm just looking at going from Rio, and I think it's really important to go right back to the UNFCCC back in 1992, which some of you remember, but others will probably not, right that way through to what that means in terms of the Paris Agreement, and then taking that onto Scotland. And I'll just go through this really quickly. I think it's really first to bear in mind that our key concern over climate change is actually the impacts. So for people like me who spend all my time looking at mitigation, we sort of tend to focus on temperature. But we must remember, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, we have to focus on the impacts, whether that's floods or droughts or fires or all the other ecological destruction that goes alongside that. So it's not temperature, it's not 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. And I think certainly for the expert community, we've got a bit obsessed by the temperatures and forgetting that actually what we're really interested in are impacts. And even there, what we're interested in is not the impacts themselves, but the rate of change of impacts. And we have to ask ourselves, can human systems adapt to such rates of change? And what are the wider impacts for ecosystems and, of course, therefore, ourselves? Temperature is literally just a proxy for the rate of change of impacts over coming years or decades. I think another key question here, which I'm not really going to get into in much detail here tonight, but is who's the we? Who makes the choices about what is and isn't dangerous? The we part is hugely important and has been deliberately underplayed by the expert community, by the policy community for a very long time. What is clear, I think, from what we have out there already is that net zero 2050 should not be our concern. It's become a ruse used widely to hide inaction, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But I've recently, along with two Tyndall Centre colleagues, published something in relation to net zero 2050 and the Committee on Climate Change, which is now online. It was in the conversation, which you might want to have a look at. And net zero, I think, is very severely compromising our Paris commitments. So I want to go back to UNFCCC and say, what is it we've committed to? And two elements to that. And I'll take out the legal speak here. First is Article 2 about preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Put simply, we need to cut emissions so as to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. And then the dangerous there is really important to bear that in mind. But also that we promise to cut emissions in line with common but differentiated responsibilities. In other words, cut emissions fairly with development nations taking the lead. And I think when we consider any future COPs, after the UNFCCC, any COPs up to now and out in the future, we have to bear in mind they are all just an interpretation based on the latest science of the original UNFCCC agreement. So we have to remember to go back to that. Now, we didn't define dangerous quantitatively for another 23 years after the UNFCCC, which is in the Paris agreement, which you'll all be familiar with, hold to 1.5 and pursue hold to 2 and pursue 1.5. And to do that, guided by science, and very much on the basis of equity. And that, of course, has occurred for every COP up till then and since then. But I think we have to then bear in mind that since Paris, initially we had the special report on 1.5 degrees centigrade, now a wealth of other work that's come out from the academic community saying how important 1.5 is. And that's a much more appropriate threshold for dangerous than it is 2 degrees centigrade. So I think in many respects now that the 1.5 is very much the new 2 degrees centigrade. I'll come back to this later because is it in any way viable or possible anymore? But I think we have to remind ourselves of what we signed up to. Going back here, we have signed up to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. If that's 1.5, not 2, then we have to say, well, what does 1.5 mean when we look at that today? So what we can then go to the other part of Paris and the UNFCCC. We need to be guided by the science on this. The science can only guide us. Remember, science can't tell us what is dangerous. Scientists have their own view, but that's a political decision as to what is and is not dangerous. And then you might ask again, who's the we that decides that? But the science can tell us something about the timeline and the rate of change in terms of emissions for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. And the latest IPCC report, which is now quite a long time ago, 2020 and 2021, what we get from that are tables like this, which you don't have to worry about the numbers in detail, but for 1.5 degrees centigrade, or indeed 2 degrees centigrade from 2020, it gives you a range of what we call carbon budgets. That's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit for certain chances of staying below these temperatures. And we then have an idea of how much CO2 we can emit, and that tells us very clearly how many tons of fossil fuels we can emit, how much oil, gas, and coal, and so forth. Which goes back to Caroline's discussion earlier about can you open new fields and still stay within these budgets. Now, what's important here to bear in mind, this is from 2020, so I'll just pass over those notes there. Since 2020, we've emitted over 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide globally, 200 billion tons. Since Paris, it's about over a third of a trillion tons. And since the UNFCCC, it's about 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. So every year, the problem gets more challenging. Also, the science has improved significantly from what fed into assessment report 6, significantly opposite on issues of aerosols and their impact on warming, but also a number of other impacts and other scientific issues that we've got a better handle on now than we had before. So I use as my guide the carbon budgets that came out in 2023 from Robin Lamble and colleagues. He and other colleagues in that paper were involved in the original IPCC and our 6 reports. And indeed, since then, Piers Forster, interim chair of the Committee on Climate Change, has papers out that have very similar budgets to these. So if you update the budgets to 2025 with the latest science, then what that can tell you for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade is what the remaining carbon budget is. And even optimistically, and there's been a more recent paper from Piers Forster saying that even this number is too high. We know for 1.5, we've got somewhere around about 160 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and that increases significantly to about 570 or 580 tons of billion tons for 2 degrees centigrade. Now, that might mean very little to most people, but that's 4 to 14 years of current emissions. And remember, 1.5 now is the more appropriate threshold from what we understand from the science of what should be classified as dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That means 4 years of current emissions. If you go by Piers Forster's recent paper, it's only about 2.5 years of current emissions. If you look at the reduction rate here, these are global reduction rates. We'd have to bring emissions down at around about 20% every single year. And that same number came out from a recent Met Office report this year. So globally, 20% per annum cuts every year for 1.5. Even for 2 degrees centigrade, we need about 7% every year, which is about 2% more than we saw in the most stringent year of COVID. So it gives you a flavour of just how hugely demanding this is. If you look at zero dates for 1.5, we're talking globally at about 2032, 2033, and probably out to about 2050 for 2 degrees centigrade. Remember, this is global, and this is if you start bringing emissions down now very rapidly indeed. Every month, we're using up the 1.5 budget at between 2 and 3% every single month. And for well below 2, it's now well over 0.5%, 0.6%, possibly 0.7% every single month. The sad conclusion that I and other colleagues draw here is that it is now no longer possible to hit even a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, you're probably all aware of this, but unfortunately, repeatedly, it's given the impression that we can somehow still stay there. That opportunity, unfortunately, has gone now. We had a little bit more chance 2 or 3 years ago. That's been pretty much been squandered. What's important to bear in mind is that by the early 2030s, 2 degrees C then, well below 2 degrees C then, will be where 1.5 is today. So that tells you the time frame for action is about between now and 2030. But we also promised to reduce emissions on the basis of equity, common but differentiated responsibility. So if you look at the budget here, you then take the global carbon budget, you split it between developed and developing countries, bearing in mind that about 82, 83% of the world's population are in developing countries, not developed countries. And I accept this is a poor division of the world, that obviously China and Rwanda are very different, but nevertheless, under the current classification in the COPs and the Paris and so forth, this is still the nomenclature that's actually used. You can then say something about how big is the carbon budget for developed countries. You can then bring that down to the UK. And in fact, myself and a number of Tyndall Centre colleagues did this in a paper in 2021. And then you can say something about how much should Scotland get. Now, as you break the budget down, each time there's a set of assumptions you have to apply. So there's greater uncertainty. What we did in our paper was to still favouring the developed countries. So it still isn't fair. It still doesn't fit really with our CBDR, our common but differentiated responsibilities as a wealthy part of the world. But nevertheless, it's much more stringent than you get out of the Committee on Climate Change. If we looked, this is for Scotland. Please note here, I've put this as this is in red here. These numbers are very approximate. The values for the UK we have a more robustly checked through, but this is very approximate for Scotland, and it's for guidance only. But it would be something very similar to this. You'd have something like 220. This is for 2 degrees centigrade, or well below 2 degrees centigrade. About 220 million tonnes of CO2 that you can emit. That's about 5 years of current emissions in Scotland for 2 degrees centigrade. It'd be 2 years or less than 2 years for 1.5. That's a reduction rate of round about 15% every single year, or a zero emission date by about 2038 if you just draw a straight line. Remember, this is for 2 degrees centigrade, which has much more devastating impacts than 1.5. So this already is failing on UNFCCC. This already does not embed as thoroughly as we would like to the fairness aspect that's embedded in every single COP. And simply we can't do that for practical reasons, because otherwise you end up with reduction rates that are not achievable. The arguments often made, you'll hear this from the Committee on Climate Change, I'm sure you'll find the Scottish MPs, some of them will say this, and we hear it certainly in the UK more generally, that isn't the UK doing well? We're the first economy to halve our emissions since 1990. Well, if you count international aviation and shipping emissions, if you look at imports and exports, the reduction has been nearer 20% since 1990. That's about 0.6% every single year as an average, 0.6%. There are no progressive countries in the global north, not Denmark, not Sweden, not France, not the EU, not the UK, not Scotland. No country is progressive. We are all failing abysmally on the commitments that we repeatedly sign up to year after year. And I want to bring out, this relates to the paper that, or the article that myself and colleagues have written recently for the conversation. I would argue that colonialism is deeply at play here. If you look at the much heralded 81% reduction the UK is going to deliver by 2035, this came out in last COP29, I'm sure you can all remember this. That 81% reduction, first it excludes aviation and shipping, include those, and their reduction is 78%, so already it starts to be tweaked. This is production figures, not consumption figures, so it doesn't take into account the fact that this laptop, so this iPad I'm using today, was no doubt built in China. We're blaming the Chinese for the emissions for the iPad that I'm using here. So it's not taking that into account, it's just production-based emissions. The 81% target was not new. It's part of the balanced net zero 2050 pathway, which I'm sure you're all reasonably familiar with. The government and the Committee on Climate Change claim that the NDC and the pathway is in line with the UK's fair role for 1.5 degrees centigrade. They explicitly wrote a letter from the CCC to the Minister to make this point back in November last year. And yet, if you look at the carbon budget under the UK's balanced net zero pathway, it has 3 times the emissions per capita of the global average. As if you took the whole budget for the globe, split it amongst all of the 8.2 billion people on the planet, what we're saying here, what the CCC assume, what the UK government assumes, is the UK should get 3 times more per person. Now, this hasn't been picked up by academics, but it just takes a little bit of maths to do this. The colonialism is deeply embedded with the norms of our climate policy. And we need to start to think about that more honestly, and what the implications are for our engagement with our policymakers on this. Why is this so different to net zero? Now, I'm not going to go into detail here, but I would argue that net zero 2050 framing, indeed often how net zero is used more generally, it's an expedient accountancy framework that masquerades as if it's science-based. It embeds a deeply colonial division of the global carbon budget between developed and developing nations. It relies hugely on tens, if not more likely hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal technologies, negative emission technologies, in the future by our children and our grandchildren, to to suck the emissions out of the atmosphere and store that away somewhere. These are technologies that are deeply speculative at scale. There are a few pilot schemes with a few thousand tons here and there, and yet every single scenario is reliant on well, collectively hundreds of billions of tons of capture. And that allows us to say we can expand our airports, we can develop more oil and gas and so forth. I would also argue that it doesn't take into account, it allows us not to consider the deep inequalities within our society about who emits within, say, UK society or within the Scottish society. That is not fairly distributed either. This is true of all IPCC scenarios and the balanced net zero 2050 pathway. Some people argue that net zero is a useful policy because it brings everyone together. To me, that there's a real vagueness that's embedded in net zero that allows us to avoid the rapid phase out of fossil fuels. All of these organisations here have net zero 2050 targets. Not one of them has any intention of stopping oil and gas production. This is all about the operational side, not about the production side. And of course, the oil and gas will be burnt. All these countries have net zero 2050 targets, yet every one of them is looking for more oil and gas. And even the UK, despite the very weak pledges of Labour, appears to be looking to seek more oil and gas. Now, I know already you're talking about Rosemount here, but there's the work that's going on in Lincolnshire, where they're looking at more oil and gas facilities as well. I'm involved in one of the court cases there at this moment. So there is no real intention from the government, it would appear, to say that moratorium is to stand. And that's in stark contrast to the UN Secretary General's very clear statement at the recent COP, when he said today's fossil fuel producers and their enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that this business model is inconsistent with human survival. Now, we're not saying that all humans would be extinct here, but anything that would resemble sort of how we see the world today, or any sort of civilized, if that's what we are, anyway, civilized sort of society, that would not be able to exist if we keep looking to burn the fossil fuels that the fossil fuel companies want to produce, and so do often our governments. I'm using a quote here from Frederick Bastiat, who was a contemporary of Adam Smith, and I think this is really important because he captures something that I think why we're failing. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in our society, and men and women in our society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorises it and a moral code that glorifies it. And we've seen exactly that happen globally now. But I would argue still further on climate change. It's also got an academia that justifies it and the media disseminates it. And I will, with respect, I would say that some of the NGOs have also parroted the same message. We need to step back from this and start to say, well, what do we actually need to deliver to meet our commitments that we've made, whether that's politically palatable or not? That capture is almost complete. This is a statement from the CEO of the Committee on Climate Change, just before he left recently to become Ed Miliband's climate change guru. And this is about 1.5. If you're a person going about your day-to-day life in Britain right now, I don't think your day-to-day life will be that different in 2050 when we hit net zero. You'll still be driving your car, you'll still be warming your house, you'll have a job which is probably very similar to one you have now. It's not frightening. You can still fly off on holiday each year. You can still have a steak if you want to. There's no huge shift here. This in no way, shape or form can be reconciled with anything like the science on climate change around 1.5 degrees centigrade. And yet there was virtually no comeback from the academic or expert community on this, or indeed many of the NGOs. The seventh carbon budget report, I would argue, is another sort of detailed sort of example of the capture that we've got here. So it looks deeply thought through, but when you unpick the numbers in the seventh carbon budget report, it demonstrates this deeply sort of colonial framing that we've got. It demonstrates the ability to carry on with business as usual, with technology tweaks in the future that are going to deliver the sort of changes that are necessary. It's fraudulent. It simply cannot align with our commitments that we've made. I'm not going to go through these numbers now, but I've touched on these earlier. So my headline conclusions are that, and I say this first one with sort of deep regret, is that for a 50% chance of 1.5, we'd need 25% cuts at least every single year from the UK and 20% globally. It would also require rapid cuts in non-CO2 emissions. If you think about liquefied natural gas or blue hydrogen, these things are locking in ongoing high levels of non-CO2 emissions, which make the budgets even more challenging. And as this is why I say I say it's a very heavy heart. I can't see that 1.5 is any longer possible. And let's just reflect. I'm sure many of you think about this anyway. What that means. That means that poor communities, typically a long way from here, that are much more vulnerable in their position, both geographically but also financially, in relation to climate change. And they are often people of colour, of course. That these societies we have actively been prepared to sacrifice because we have not been prepared to make those changes that are necessary in our societies. The worrying thing is that even for 2 degrees centigrade now, that the cuts are 14, 15, 16% every single year for wealthy countries like the UK, the EU, the US, Australia, Japan, and so forth. Even globally, we need cuts of 7% or more. The global NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the promises we've all made, if we follow those through, then even by the early 2030s, 2 degrees centigrade will be rapidly heading to where 1.5 degrees centigrade is today. In other words, not achievable. So the time frame to delivering major cuts in the CO2 emissions is between now and 2030. Not after 2030, that's also important. But if we haven't actually delivered the cuts, not put in place the policies, but actually delivered them by 2030, we'll have effectively locked out 2 degrees centigrade and more, well below 2 degrees centigrade. You'll then have a very low chance of it. Will be much more a higher chance of 2.5 degrees and heading up towards 3 degrees, and with all the other tipping point issues there, possibly even 4. So I think there is an essential role for NGOs in here. And I just touched on these. This is your terrain, not mine. And this holds for lots of us in the academic community. I think integrity is important. Abide by consistent and transparent principles. And of the formal NGOs, my experience with Friends of the Earth has been that you have been the exemplar of that. Some of the other NGOs have not been that consistent or transparent. Cogency is really important. We have to apply clear and logical reasoning as to what our arguments are so that the public and the policymakers indeed can follow that. And then I would also go as far as to say you also, NGOs are important in keeping the academics honest, if you like. You have to have honesty. You've got to hold feet to the fire of the policymakers, the companies, and indeed, I think, the academics. And you have to have the courage not to bend to align with sort of the ephemeral political sensibilities of the time. You've got to be prepared to counter established views, however powerful they are. That's a huge responsibility on you. I would like to think that you could work hand in hand with the academic community, but my experience thus far is that we collectively, at least, have failed the NGO community in trying to hold our policymakers to account. And I think communication is really important. It's not the area I know a lot about, but I think we do require sort of diverse narratives. We have to look for the appropriate metaphors, but not abuse those metaphors. And we have to find accessible language. As academics, we're bad at all of those, I have to say. Your voices have never been more needed than they are today, I would argue. And I finish off here with a quote from Robert Unger. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And I think there's a partnership here between perhaps the NGOs and the academics to be the people that have that imagination, have that clarity to conceive of different futures. But those different futures have to come about very rapidly indeed. And this is the sort of the strapline for my talk. Sort of beginning optimism of the intellect. Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will from Gramsci. And that's where we are. If you look at the numbers, you look at the arguments, look where the politics is going, you can't be anything other than deeply pessimistic. But that is absolutely no reason to give in. Maybe that's a reason to be more optimistic from the will to drive change. And if that will ever exists anywhere, it exists, of course, in the people that are in the NGOs. So I hope that's useful in some ways.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. That was really incredible, and yeah, really resonated with your points there on integrity, and your sort of roundup about the will to drive. What I will do is, if people have questions, if you put them in the chat. We have less than 15 minutes left, so I think what we'll do in this particular meeting is we'll maybe forego the breakout rooms. We just don't have the time, but we can take some of the learnings and the sentiments that have been talked about and drawn out today and take this into the next national meeting and really have space to discuss that. So if people want to put their questions in the chat, and Kevin could answer those?
Could you just read the ones out you think are the most pertinent? Would that be
Yeah,
okay?
of course. I will. I'll read them out. Okay, yeah. So we have a question from Steve here about 1.5 being a political goal. And the scientist, Mr. Hansen, argued 1.1 degrees was the basic safe limit. Do you have a perspective on that?
Well, firstly, I mean, Jim Hansen may be perfectly right about that, but because that's his judgment. And so if you ask a scientist who happens to live in Alaska, or ask a scientist who happens to live on the coastal strip of Bangladesh, they probably have a very different view as to what is dangerous. Dangerous is by definition political. It cannot be defined by science rather. Scientists have their own view. Science informs the view that we all may have on dangerous. And to me, that's the purpose of one of the purposes of the COPs. And actually, this particular part is done well. The COPs have brought together in a very messy, unsatisfactory way. They bring together the different views of people in different countries, and then they eventually come out to say, yeah, well, 1.5 is probably now the dangerous threshold, informed by the science. I think it's also fair to say that probably if you asked a lot of people in some of the poorer parts of the world, they'd say 1.5 is already too dangerous. And so Jim Hansen's view that 1.1 was already a dangerous threshold certainly would be valid to many, many people. But collectively, I think I would say that's what our COP processes are in their inadequate way that they do that, and very much biased. That we is biased to the global north, of course, and the wealthy in the global north. So I think we have to be quite careful about those temperatures representing a fair view of 8.2 billion people. They probably don't. Nevertheless, I think given where we are today, 1.5 is the best that we could possibly achieve. And as I say, I don't think anymore that it is achievable. There is that doesn't mean we just get away with that scot-free in the wealthy countries. I think that feeds into what the financial reparations should be between the global north and the global south. We have failed through our dishonesty in the global north to deliver what we said we would do. And therefore we should be held account through reparation to the poor parts of the world to help them adapt to the climate change that we have that we have knowingly imposed on them. So the 100 billion per year is a crumb off the rich people's table. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about numbers of trillions every single year that should be moved from the global north to the global south to deal with the climate impacts and heaven knows the other ecological impacts that to some degree, or to a high degree, we have historically imposed upon them.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I'm going to ask one more. There's been a lot of thanks in the chat, and a reminder that this presentation can be shared, and we have recorded Kevin's presentation, so that will be sent out for people who want to focus on the detail again. I will ask one question, and then we will move for a really quick round out from Caroline. So the one question is, what do you think of CCS, Kevin?
Well, I would say it's the last throw of the oil and gas industry, but it's not the last throw because they've now got BECCS or other forms of DACs and other forms of carbon dioxide removal. CCS has been spoken about for at least 25 to 30 years, and it's gone almost nowhere. If you look at the actual amount of CCS, and I'm saying it's important, carbon capture and storage, I'm not saying carbon capture, I'm saying carbon capture and storage. So a lot of the time you get false numbers given by people who ignore the storage part. So there's about 7 to 10 million tons of carbon capture and storage around the world now. 7 to 10 million tons. Our emissions from energy are about 38 billion tons. So it's 0.002% of our emissions. That's after 30 years of talking about it. So sometimes you get a slightly higher number, and that's because most carbon capture is actually used to extract more oil. So it's used there to enhance oil recovery. That's what most of it's used for. So CCS has been, although there are good people working on it, and there are good scientists, good engineers working on it, nevertheless, at a bigger picture level, CCS has been used as a way to delay regulation on the fossil fuel industry. It is still used like that, and that's what most carbon dioxide removal technologies are also used for. They're not there as functioning technologies, although there are good scientists and engineers working on them. They are primarily there to delay legislation on the fossil fuel industry, and also allow things like expansion of airports and more gas facilities and all the other things that are then claimed to be aligned with our climate commitments. So it is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And in the time frame we have now, that in fact CCS of course has delayed things, so that has fed into the time frame being so short, you simply cannot deliver technically those technologies in anything like the scale that would be necessary. And just think of CCS from a simple point of view. In the recent discussions in the UK, it's been used as a ruse to allow us to have blue hydrogen. That could not be worse. You're now going to use natural gas with all the leaks you get in that to produce hydrogen, which itself is indirectly a very powerful greenhouse gas, indirectly, about the same in over a 20-year time frame as similar to methane, say indirectly there. So we're using methane to produce what is potentially quite a dangerous greenhouse gas. And CCS has been used because it's going to be, the claim is it will capture the carbon from the methane and store it underground. So at every level there, it exacerbates the problem we have today. And that's the problem with CCS. It's been used primarily as a delay technique for regulation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. What I will do is I will move to Caroline, our head of campaigns, quickly to reflect on this. If you're there, Caroline.
Thanks. Always really stark, but really powerful to hear from you, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. Oh, yeah, I just got a couple of minutes, so I'll be really quick. But just to say, we have these national meetings on the last Wednesday of every month. So I'll be brief in what I'm going to say, but we'll come back to these things at future national meetings. It was really stark, those numbers that you gave, Kevin, for Scotland's, not even Scotland's fair share, Scotland's share of the carbon budget for 1.5 and 2 degrees. And something that's really important for folks to know is that, I'm sure many of you will be aware, the Scottish Government scrapped our climate targets last year. So they left in place net zero 2045, but they scrapped all the annual targets in between because they weren't going to meet them. And so they said, this is clearly the target's fault, not our fault. The targets could and should have been met. The targets were never strong enough to really deliver on a fair share of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And instead of holding their hands up and doubling down on the action that they need to take, they decided to scrap the annual climate targets. And when Parliament comes back, so obviously they've been off, MSPs have been off over the summer, they're going to come back next week. And one of the first things that they need to do this autumn is to vote on Scotland's new carbon budgets. Now, without getting into too much technicality, the target said every year you have to reduce your emissions X amount. So by 2030, they would have had to reduce emissions 75% on 1990. And now what we have instead, what we will have when they pass these new budgets, is 5 yearly budgets. So over a period of 5 years, you're allowed to emit an average of X megatons of carbon dioxide. There's nothing inherently better or worse in carbon budgets than climate targets. The problem is the Scottish Government's complete inaction to deliver them, to take the action that's needed to stop fossil fuels, to move away from fossil fuel transport, to move wholeheartedly towards renewables, to stop relying on CCS or the dream that CCS is going to come around the corner and save them. So there's a vote that will happen. We don't yet know the date. That will happen, and MSPs will be asked to vote on these new carbon budgets. The new carbon budgets will see them slowing down. We'll see Scotland slowing down on climate action at exactly the time that we need them to be speeding up, and we need to hold them accountable for that. And the second thing that will happen is that after they've set these budgets, They then need to publish a plan. It's called the Climate Change Plan, which will be the plan that sets out exactly how they're going to reduce emissions across Scotland, every area of our lives and our economy. And we need, again, to hold them accountable, to make sure that that is strong, that it's fast, that they're putting the money towards the right things, to make sure that they're working with communities, that it's going to bring benefits to people's lives, to communities, and it's not just handing more money and contracts to offshore multinational corporations with very rich bosses. So these are two key things that are coming up in the autumn, and I really, really encourage you. We'll let you know when these things are happening. Hold everything in your head that Kevin has said about Scotland's share and how fast we need to go, and hold everything in your head from Erica and what all of that incredible potential that there is to start holding our states accountable using international law. And we really need to be putting the pressure on in the coming months. And of course, we have a Scottish election needs to happen by the 6th of May next year. We're already seeing anti-climate, anti-net zero, anti-renewable rhetoric coming in, and we're going to see more of that. We will talk much more about the election, about that sort of pushback on climate in future national meetings, but I just want to give a shout out for a couple of very tangible things that you can do. First of all, on Thursday, the 18th of September in Edinburgh, there is a mass lobby. It's organised by SCCS, Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, a coalition which we're part of. And that's encouraging and bringing people to Edinburgh all together on one day to talk to our MSPs, lobby our MSPs about climate action. The link is in the chat. Do sign up. It's a really powerful thing to do together with people, to be taking that action together. And a second date for your diaries. And again, there will be more coming out about this. Oh, scroll down my notes. Put in your diary, Saturday, the 15th of November, there will be a climate march in Glasgow, timed for COP30 happening in Belém in Brazil. And as this Parliament is dealing with carbon budgets, with a climate change plan, and as we have an election coming next year, we need, as Kevin was saying, to hold their feet to the fire, to counter those established views, act with integrity, and really speak up, get tens of thousands on the streets. You know, there's an incredible number of people in this call tonight who could all be watching telly, and you're not, you're here because you care. And we've heard about the action of those students in the Philippines who, from their classroom to the highest international court, have managed to get this ruling that states must be held accountable. And now it is on us here in Scotland to be driving that forward and holding our MSPs, our government, accountable for climate action. So yeah, I hope to see you at the Mass Lobby in Edinburgh. I'll be there. I'll definitely be on the streets in Glasgow. And we'll be here at future national meetings to discuss more around the climate plan, more around the elections. And if you are not already a member of Friends of the Earth Scotland, please do join. We don't take money from big businesses. We don't get money from the government. We're funded and we're driven by our members. So please do join, and then you'll get the invites to come to more of these meetings. But huge thank you to Erica, huge thank you to Kevin, and huge thank you particularly to all of you for coming and listening. And yeah, I really encourage you to not sit with despair about those numbers that we heard, but drive towards action. And I'm going to leave you with a nice quote, if I can find it. Can I find it? There's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. It's Octavia Butler. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I think Caroline's rounded that out fantastically. Thank you again to Erica. Thank you to Kevin. Again, thank you all for being here. We will see you next time to talk more about this. Thank you. Bye.